Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something maybe a bit unexpected, the story behind Looney Tunes.
Yeah, that classic cartoon name. Turns out there's a surprising and kind of serious history tied to it. We're drawing from a blog post by Larry Dean on the Einganeers line.
Right. He talks about watching the cartoons as a kid, Bugs and Daffy.
Uh-huh. And then later realizing that loony, well, it's actually pretty offensive, a term for someone considered, insane.
And he connects that to the phrase loony bin. He even mentions his dad used to joke about it.
Yeah, casually threatening to send him there. But then years later, when his father actually had a mental breakdown,
Oh, wow.
that term suddenly wasn't a joke at all. It became a very real, very grim possibility they considered. Talk about a shift in perspective.
That's intense. From cartoons to this serious family situation. And it brings us to the history of these loony bins, the actual asylums or state hospitals.
Exactly. And the blog post points out something interesting about their origins in the 19th century. It wasn't all shackles and darkness, initially anyway. There was this philosophy called moral treatment.
Moral treatment, what did that involve? Sounds, well, almost gentle.
It kind of was for the time. The core idea was treating patients with kindness, dignity, respect.
Really? Back then?
Yeah, giving them things to do, occupational stuff, social activities, in a comfortable setting. There was this actual belief that this approach could lead to a cure or at least recovery.
Treating people like people, basically. Did it work?
The post suggests it had some apparent successes, yeah. Some people definitely seem to improve under that kind of care, which, probably kept the approach going for a while.
But it didn't last. What happened?
Well, familiar problems cropped up, the places got overcrowded, costs went up, it became really hard to maintain that level of individual care.
Makes sense, unfortunately.
And then in the early 20th century, you had these big shifts in thinking about the mind.
Ah, the blog mentions Freud, right?
Mm-hmm.
And eugenics.
Exactly. Freudian psychology shifted the focus inward onto sort of internal conflicts, moving away from the environmental focus of moral treatment,
Okay.
and then eugenics. Well, that was a really dangerous path. It focused more on controlling populations, not on therapy.
So these new ideas actually led to less effective treatment.
Often, yeah. Sometimes things got actively worse for patients, and all the while, the number of people needing care kept growing. It was a tough situation.
So fast forward a bit. The late 1960s. Big changes then.
Huge changes. That's when the move away from those large state psychiatric hospitals really started. Deinstitutionalization.
Right, closing down the loony bins.
Essentially, yes. Over the next 30 years, the
Yeah.
idea was to move people into community-based care.
But the communities weren't ready.
Not really, no. The blog points out it took maybe another 20 years after that for mental illness to start being widely seen as a genuine health issue that needed proper resources. Big lag time.
So people were left without adequate support.
That was often the outcome, sadly. Which brings us closer to today, where the main approach is often medication.
And medication has helped a lot of people, right? Finding balance, living productive lives.
Absolutely. It can be incredibly beneficial. But, as the blog acknowledges, there are side effects to consider too. It's not always a simple fix.
Which loops back to that earlier idea.
Mhm.
The blog post poses this really interesting question.
Mm.
Could that old moral treatment, the kindness and dignity approach,
Mm-hmm.
could it actually have cured more people? Maybe through more natural, less invasive ways?
It's impossible to know, obviously, but it makes you think. The author even draws a parallel to, training animals with positive reinforcement versus trying similar things with kids, how different approaches work for different complex beings.
It shows how complicated understanding behavior and well-being really is.
Totally. It's just wild how we started with Looney Tunes, this silly cartoon thing,
Yeah.
and ended up tracing this whole arc of how society has grappled, often poorly, with mental illness. That lighthearted name against a really serious backdrop.
It really puts things in perspective. So, wrapping up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
it makes you wonder, doesn't it? We see these cycles in how we approach complex problems.
Mm-hmm.
What ideas from the past, maybe even discarded ones like moral treatment, might actually hold some useful insights for the challenges we face now. Not just in mental health, but, other fields too.
That's a great thought to leave people with. Are there forgotten lessons we could revisit?
Something to chew on.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for exploring this fascinating and kind of sobering connection with us today.
He quickly learned to push the lever, as well as several other tricks, with me using only positive reinforcements. Later on I tried the same methods on my kids, and had much poorer results. I found that negative reinforcements were necessary, and even then the results were dubious at best. But I did find the methods worked quite well in directing young engineers. Whatever happened to Algernon, the Einganeer's line, December 12, 2024 blog. I also regretted having learned from my father, who had a mental breakdown in his 50s, how to, and not to, siphon gasoline by sucking on a tube. An Einganeer's Tale, page 38. Remember when Warner Brothers' Looney Tunes was the most popular show on Saturday morning television? Being a kid, I didn't realize that loony was really a derogatory term for lunatic, which also meant insane. I thought it was funny when my father would jokingly threaten to send my mother to the loony bin. It wasn't so funny when, years later, we actually did consider sending my father to one. I recently learned that loony bins, aka insane asylums or state hospitals, were not always places of torture, neglect, diabolical medical procedures, restraints, and confinement. In fact, most were founded during the 19th century to practice a very humane technique known as moral treatment. Moral treatment involved treating individuals with kindness, dignity, and respect, while also providing opportunities for occupational and social activities in a clean, comfortable, home-like environment. It was believed that moral treatment would eventually cure an individual's mental illness, and should be continued as long as necessary, even if for the rest of a patient's life. In many cases, moral treatment did appear to cure patients, but many also were not cured. Continuing their treatment eventually led to overcrowding and spiraling costs. Then, the rise of early 20th century thought concerning psychiatrics, Freudian psychology, and eugenics led to other attempted means of curing the incurable, and eventually displaced moral treatment completely. Its successes, however, were no better than that of moral treatment, and in many cases, worse. The mentally ill population continued to grow. By the late 1960s, most mental illness professionals had given up on loony bins. All state psychiatric hospitals would be closed over the next 30 years, and their patients deinstitutionalized. Communities themselves would be left to deal with mental illness through assimilation and local health care facilities. It would be another 20 years before mental illness would truly be considered a health concern. Treating mental illness now seems to have largely evolved to prescribing the right cocktail of medications. There is no doubt that medications have brought balance to many individuals who have displayed mental illness behaviors, thereby enabling them to lead full, productive lives, despite each medication's disabling side effects. But, how many of these individuals might have also been cured through natural, less invasive, moral treatment techniques? We will never know.